Hello everyone and welcome to the first in my tutorial series of videos helping you get started in soft pastel. Today's tutorial we will be looking at papers. What should you use? And that obviously is a huge debate among many pastelists. So we're going to look at both non-sanded, sanded and misc papers. Everything from your classic ingress papers, your sanded papers like Pastelmat, and the more extreme kind of miscellaneous papers like velour or creating your own sanded surfaces or textured surfaces to work on. So let's get started, and if you have any questions, obviously please put them in the comment box below and I will get back to you. Otherwise, enjoy the new tutorial series and I hope you guys find it really useful. Pastel papers have been around for a considerable amount of time, mostly though in paper format like the three here in front of us, rather than the sanded format which then evolved later on as techniques for moulding paper, adhering surfaces to paper became easier to produce with certain machinery and mechanics and engineering. So a lot of the original artists like Degas and that actually drew and sketched and painted on more common papers, the types that we see here. Now, ingress paper is a type of paper with a very particular pattern, almost like a chain link pattern when seen up close, and that was created by Jean-Claude Ingress, no surprise, and he basically created this pressed mould method, and the mould had this pattern, so when the paper was pressed against the mould, that pattern would transfer to the paper, and when the paper dried, that pattern remained, and that chain link pattern enabled the paper to hold layers of pastel. Now, it also helped that the paper itself is cotton, has a high percentage of cotton. Cotton is really important because the fine fibres in cotton allow the pastel to stick to the paper a lot easier than some of the more smoothest papers, like cartridge paper. So here we've got three examples of standard pastel paper, so non-sanded papers. I'm pretty sure that most of you will have seen these because these are two very common names in the market. However, as you can see from the information to the left here, almost said right, you can see there are other brands available, and on the next page you'll be able to see some of the other brands, the costs and the kind of technical specs of each type of paper. So all of these here are 160 gram per metre squared, or a lot of people generally tend to see it as 160 GSM. And that is the weight of the paper, and that's basically how thick the paper is. And as you can see, 160 grams of paper per metre squared is then pressed. And if you press out, if you get a splodge of kind of wet paper and then press it with a certain amount of weight out, and that weight of compression spreads it out to a certain amount, and then basically they weigh how much is then left in a metre squared, and that is 160 grams. And the weight, as you can see, for most of these is 98 pounds, which is a standard weight. So let's take a look. I've got here two ingress papers, the Canson Mi-Teintes, which is a standard ingress paper, the Daolaroli ingress paper, which has been around a long time, and Daolaroli's Murano, which has kind of taken over from the ingress and is a lot more popular than the ingress now, and I'll explain more as we work with them. So let's take a look at the pad itself, right? So this is a classic pad. They come mostly in pads now like these two, not so much spiral bound. You can get them spiral bound. I hate spiral bound pads because you have a perforated line which you have to use to tear the page away, and it never tears correctly ever. So this is our pad, and as most of these, they have a range of colours in them. This one you can see is our warm tones. And then we've got our neutrals in the Canson. They do have lots of different colours. The Canson No More, they've actually reduced their range of ingress papers. You can get them as sheets more than pads now, and even then, not so much, and that's because they are pushing their new Canson Velvet. And then we have our larger pad here of the Daolaroli Ingress. I've had this a long time, so you can see it's well used and in bits, which doesn't help. Originally, they used to come with sheets of glassine in between each page, but I think the manufacturers have slowly realised over time that once you've completed a piece in these pads, you tend to take that piece out and store it somewhere else, so you generally don't store. They were trying to treat them a bit more like sketch pads, And a lot of pastel work in the early years, and I mean the early years, was mainly sketching and not full-blown paintings. You would do loads of sketches and then you would paint in oils, for example. So having something like the glassine in between was common, and they were seen more as sketchbooks rather than actual workable surfaces for creating actual paintings on. But now, as we go into the modern era, you can see the Murano, no glassine. The Canson, no glassine. So you can kind of see the shift of people, the way people are using these papers now. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these out of the way, and then we will take a closer look at the paper, the texture, and what it's like with some pastel on it. Right, let's take a quick look at texture. So this is a piece of the Canson Mi-Teintes, so it is an ingress paper and has a very kind of chain-like pattern, which is part of the mould that the paper is pressed from. So we'll be able to see that texture once we apply pastel. So this is, bring it into shot, this is a Rembrandt pastel, so this is a medium soft pastel, and this will do really well on this paper. So we're just going to start at the top and just pull it down a line, and you'll be able to see the pattern and texture of the paper. And there you go. You can see straight away the texture of the ingress paper, and that is what gives it its name and type, and what you can see. So here I have two pieces of the Canson Mi-Teintes. As you can see, this was our test piece earlier to show to you the texture, and I have an empty blank piece here. And what I'm going to look at is blending. How well can you blend on this paper before it starts getting too muddy? How many layers do you reckon I can get down? And how it kind of looks as you're starting to work on those layers. So with this piece here, obviously I did a number of quick passes with the pastels. There isn't much pastel down because you can still see the texture. And I'm just going to blend this with my finger. And you can see that's given quite a nice even coating all the way across. And you can also see where it fades out at the edges. Now, that's just one layer, and if I run my finger over it, it does still come off. I'm then going to add an orange across the top. So I'm going to turn it round, go the other way. And you can see the orange had no problem going across the top of that whatsoever. So now I'm going to try blending with two colours next to each other, cross blending and also one on top of the other. So I'm going to do 3 passes of the yellow there. And actually I'll do the orange right next to it, like that. And then we'll blend the two. And there we go, we've got a fairly nice gradient. The pastels I've used are both Rembrandts, they're both a medium type, so I'm not worried about using 2 different pastels to see if I can get hard over medium. I know that I can go over this with a hard pastel without any problem at all. And we can create shapes, we can create grasses, and you can see it is picking up the peachy orange colour, but not much. Now here we're going to do yellow, blend it, and then add an orange over the top and create 2 solid colours, but one on top of the other. So there's our yellow. This is our orange. We're going to put the orange here. And then we're going to blend the orange. And we've had no problems there whatsoever. However, you can see it's very easily picked up the yellow underneath and made it slightly more yellow-orange than the peachy orange it was. But we're still okay for the minute. Now I'm going to add another yellow over the top. So we'll take it here. And now you can see, when I do this, that the orange has already filled the tooth. Now that I've put that down, none of the yellow is going in the tooth. It's going around each of the dimples. So if you imagine a chain shape, and if I draw that on here, so imagine a chain is like this, okay? What you're seeing on this here is the yellow here is the yellow outline and orange in the middle, which means that the indented middle of the chain is filled with the orange already. And this is where it starts getting really muddy, because there is so much pastel filled the grain now that almost instantly, the minute I was trying to smooth out the yellow, it's gone, it's melded into the orange. So that was not really very many passes, to be honest, just 2. However, if you think and plan ahead with your colours, then you'll be able to get your 2 layers and possibly even 3 if you're careful, and be able to work with that really well. Like I said earlier, some of the easiest methods of doing that is to use underpaintings, because that will push the pigment into the paper more without necessarily filling the grain, allowing you to have maybe 1 or 2 more layers. So this paper is really good for being very budget friendly, very versatile and very flexible. You can buy it in bulk, you can buy it in big sheets, which allows you to really get to play with the paper, play with pastels and be really expressive without having to worry about wasting expensive paper, planning how you're going to do your layers and having to conserve your resources. Now, the non-sanded papers like these don't eat up pastels because they don't take enough pastel into the grain to be able to eat them up, whereas obviously sanded papers do. So economically and budget-wise, these papers are really great. However, if you are just starting into pastel, these papers can be hard work, and I know some of you are going to agree with this, that these type of papers have probably put you off. You've probably put pastel down, tried to layer it following a tutorial from one of your favourite YouTubers, obviously me, and cannot get the same results that they're getting. And the reason for that is you lose some of the vibrancy, you lose your layering, you lose your ability to create lots of expression and texture over the top of each other. I'm not saying that these papers are bad, they are really good for beginners, but you have to understand how to use them first. If you follow my tips and guidance in this video, you'll be able to create really good pieces from where you are in your stage in the pastel journey, and you'll be able to express yourself, really get to play with your pastels and understand how these mediums work, what works best for you, and also being able to just play, get messy, and in my case, get yellow and orange everywhere. So, as you can see, we are going to now take a look at some of the sanded papers. Most of the sanded papers out there are graded, so you basically go from your rough to your smooth sanded papers. Your rough end, you're kind of looking at the most fabulous of papers like UArt with the Fisher 400. It's an excellent rough surface, graded very similarly like DIY sandpaper, and with the same sort of coarseness. You can go from smooth to rough with their range, but they are still quite a coarse paper, and it is like working with sandpaper. However, the advantage of it, and because of the way they produce their paper, they hold tons and tons of layers. It's a real workhorse of a paper for pastel. However, if you're looking for real smoothness, you're going to be doing a lot of blending, and you're going to need a lot of tools to do that. In front of me here, I have another 2 common papers that can be found easily on the market, Pastelmat and the Canson Mi-Teintes Touch. Now, you've already seen the Mi-Teintes non-sanded paper from Canson at the start of this video, and now you're seeing the sanded version. Pastelmat, a Clairefontaine paper, almost more like card than paper because it's quite a weighty paper, at just over 360 gram GSM, so it's a pretty much more card than paper really, and they are both classed as relatively smooth sanded papers, so their texture is quite smooth to the touch. The Pastelmat is a little bit more gritty and heavy bodied versus the Touch, which is not, but both produce very smooth application for pastel, but also can take a lot of layers. I would still say the Pastelmat can take more layers than the Touch, just because the Touch has a finer grain of particles on its surface to the Pastelmat, and therefore it takes a little less pastel to fill it than the Pastelmat, which is just slightly coarser and therefore can take a few more layers. I'll also be looking at Colourfix in this video. Now, Colourfix is an art spectrum paper. They haven't been around as long as some of the other paper makers around the world at the moment. However, they do produce a very good budget version of this. So it is a smooth sanded paper, same fineness of grit to the paper, almost the same paper weight to it, and is usually cheaper than the Touch. So what we're going to do now is we'll take a look at the textures. So as you can see, we are going to now take a look at some of the sanded papers. Most of the sanded papers out there are graded, so you basically go from your rough to your smooth sanded papers. Your rough end, you're kind of looking at the most fabulous of papers like UArt with the Fisher 400. It's an X. Right, I have here a piece of the charcoal grey Pastelmat. So you can see there's the thickness, and you can just about see the kind of slightly grainy texture to the surface. It does have a slight shine in this light as well. Right, I'm going to pop it down there, and same as the previous test, I'm going to use a Rembrandt pastel because it's a nice medium pastel, so you can kind of see more or less what you're probably going to get from this thing. So I'm just going to hold it down and pull down. I'm also going to show it to you with a Conte, which is one of our hard pastels. Right, so there you can see the texture of the Pastelmat. You can see really clearly the difference between the medium pastel and the hard pastel. The fact that the Pastelmat is gripping both relatively well, and this means that you can definitely get a lot of layering on this type of paper. But you can see the kind of sanded papers have a sanded style texture, very speckly, with lots of fine holes and gaps between each grain in order to capture that pastel and hold it onto the paper. Now, one of the things that is great about sanded paper is that it has great adhesion. Now, when I mean adhesion, I mean how much does the pastel stick to the paper. In the case of non-sanded papers, as it's quite common, you run your finger over the pastel and it comes away on your finger. It also smudges everywhere, it can get into places you don't want. It just doesn't adhere to the paper without being still able to be easily lifted and moved around, which is honestly something you do not want. Whereas sanded papers, because the gaps are quite deep between each grain that's affixed to the paper, that pastel's deep enough that when you bring your finger over it or try to move it around, it's not going to be easily lifted out of that hole. So I'll show you. If I run my finger across it, it almost looks like I haven't done anything to it. And you can see a small amount of pastel on my finger, but not much. And it's really going to take me a lot to keep working at this to even get it to blend. I mean, you saw how easy it was to blend on the non-sanded paper, and this is me trying to blend the same medium pastel but on a sanded paper, and it is just not budging. I can barely get it to smudge outside of its lines. So that's what we mean by adhesion. It means that it has good adhesion levels, the pastel sticks to it, ingrains itself between the grains and therefore doesn't lift easily. So let's take a look at some of the other textures and the other two types of paper. And then we'll have a look at blending and see what we can do. Now here we have three pieces of different sanded papers. So we have Pastelmat, we have the Art Spectrum Colourfix, and we have the Mi-Teintes Touch. So I'm just going to quickly show you what it's like just across them and the sort of texture you'll get from those. I might use a darker colour on the lighter paper, but certainly the yellow will do on the Mi-Teintes. And we'll use our bright orange on the Pastelmat. And also on our Colourfix here. And you ignore the lines, it's just I was marking it up for something else and decided to use it for this instead. Right, hopefully you can see there is a difference between them. If I bring all three of these together, turn that one round, you should be able to see, if I bring these up here, you should be able to see the noticeable difference. So the Pastelmat is significantly smooth, and it's not that far off the Mi-Teintes, but like I said, you'll get more layers with the Pastelmat than the Touch. You'll still get way more layers than if you were using non-sanded, but it's always good to note this is still going to be slightly grainier than the Touch because of how fine the particles are on this paper. The colour fix is slightly more abrasive, so if you run your fingers over it, you can feel it, and you can see the texture is a lot grainier than the other two. But you can still get as many layers on the colour fix as you can on the Touch. You just sometimes have to plan a bit more in advance when doing so. So what I'm going to do is show you what it's like to layer. I'll take the colour fix out of the way, and we'll just do it with these two. So we've got obviously our orange here. I'm just going to smooth that down with my finger. Not that it's going to make much difference at this point, but if you're using alcohol and water, all these papers take alcohol and water and any mixed wet medium fine. And I'm going to, should we go the other way? So I'll just go this way, across it. And you can see it quite happily layered the yellow easily over the top without any worry at all. Now I'm going to blend this and see, because of how fine the particles are on here, there's still a lot of pastel lifting and moving around a wee bit, and because of that I am able to smooth this out. Now that is an advantage if you're doing a lot of colour blocking and you want to be able to get nice smooth colour before layering down another colour over the top. You can't really do that with Pastelmat without using either something like pan pastels, which are made to do which are very fine and therefore can be applied in a way that means they will provide a smooth coverage and get into every crack and crevice, unlike a pastel when applied to the paper. The Touch is just like you'd expect a standard pastel paper to be. For sanded paper, you apply the pastel and you can rub it in, but it's still holding a lot of pastel. So I'm going to take the orange and we're going to go over the top. I'm somehow getting orange everywhere as well. And you can see, because it's finer and it's gripping more of the pastel, it's more, you can see you get more over the top. And then if I blend it, you can see we're still getting relatively close to the colour that it is laid down without it mixing too much with the colour below. And that's a major difference compared to what we were finding with, for example, our non-sanded papers. And the reason for that is because there's so much of the pastel sitting on top of the tooth of the paper and the grit of the paper that it's very easy to then move around and mix with whatever pastel you then try and layer over the top. Although I've smoothed this out, like I was able to do with the non-sanded papers, I'm still able to cleanly put another colour over the top without it mixing. And the same with the Pastelmat, but obviously the Pastelmats requiring more layers of colour to make it more solid, unless you're going to use something like pan pastel or alcohol or water to mix it up and spread it out and get it into the grains, and then you'll get a smooth colour. So we're going to try and do another pass. We'll do another pass of orange going the other way, I think. We'll just keep going backwards and forwards quite easily. So you can still see some of the yellow through, but not much. I'm just going to smooth that. Like I said, not going to make much difference. And the same yellow going the other way. And you can see it's starting to struggle to hold the pastel. So I will try it again, give it another pass. Slightly better with me pushing down, but still, if I try and smooth it out, you can see it is starting to mix. Not much, but if you leave it enough, you'll be able to get a solid colour over the top of it. This, no issue so far. We'll turn this one around and go the other way again with the yellow. And no, we're still getting a clean colour over the top. Back to this one, orange again. And yeah, it is starting to, the touch is starting to struggle a wee bit at this point. And this one, still taking layers. We'll try one more time with the touch. And we're getting a lot of pastel dust. See this here? This means that basically what isn't getting into the grain of the paper is now just sitting on the paper and being pushed with the pastel as I bring it towards me. That basically is telling me this is full. You will not be able to add any more pigment down at this point. So I'll tap that off. It's going everywhere, and I'm getting yellow and orange fingers everywhere as well, as you can see. And we will give this another go, but you can see it is starting to smear, and that's usually an indication of you getting close to your maximum as well. And yeah, nope, that's smeared. That's completely, yeah, look. If I do that now, the orange is happily mixing with the yellow, which means that it's at the point where that tooth is filled. So you can see very much so that with this type of paper, you can get a lot more layers. If you are only looking for a paper that can give you more layers than a non-sanded paper, you can get in quite big formats, is lightweight, so lighter than, say, the Pastelmat, and is smoother, so easier to blend with, then realistically you're going to be looking towards the Mi-Teintes Touch, the Colour Fix, and those sorts of smooth sanded papers. If you're looking for papers where you can apply lots of layers without necessarily blending, so if those of you who have watched videos by like Marla Baghetta, for example, you'll see she can layer down some pastel, but she doesn't really do any blending. She just swipes with the pastel, applies the colour to the piece of paper, and then puts another colour down, puts another colour down, puts another colour down. And sometimes she goes over the top of one with another colour, and it's fine. And that's kind of the usefulness of paper like Pastelmat and also UArt. It gives you a lot of layers to play with because you're not necessarily using it for blending. So if you want the kind of more blended look, in order to be able to create large areas of colour, or you want to be able to do what I do, which is then apply other mediums to create texture, then yeah, the smoother sanded papers are better, whereas the slightly more rougher, denser papers are going to be good for that. Lots of layering, details. You'll see a lot of animal artists and pet portraits, people who work in pastel, using Pastelmat over the Touch. So that's basically those. Obviously, I'll bring this one back in so you can have a nosy. And there we are. We can see there's quite a difference between the three different types. The more budget but rougher, but still just as good, and definitely a way to go if you want to take the next step up from non-sanded papers, or you just want to jump in with sanded papers. You will get your vibrancy and your blending and your ability to follow along other videos by using something like that, but still on a budget. Obviously, our Touch, if you want the next level up, if those of you have ever seen any of the work by Les Darlow, who is a big fan of the Canson Mi-Teintes Touch, you can see how he uses it with a mixture of pan pastels, pastels, and a lot of ink as well, which is really good. So this is a Conte. You can see pretty much the same on all of them when it comes to a hard pastel. It just grips. We've moved on to our final section of papers, and that is papers and surfaces that I would class as miscellaneous. So they're not standard pastel papers, however, they are also widely used and are another great surface to be able to use with pastels, charcoals, and drawing pencils. So we have the kind of one that comes up next after sanded and non-sanded papers, and that is velour. I have some Vic Bancrofts here, which she uses for lots of wildlife drawings, and you tend to see a lot more velour used for pet portraits and naturalistic wildlife paintings and that sort of thing. And then I also have things that you use to create your own surfaces. Now, I like to create textured surfaces on more wider paper. So for example, the backing paper that I'm using here is a piece of Fabriano watercolor paper. I'll often add gesso, or if I want something really textured, I'll use something like texture paste. You can even use sand. So there's lots of options out there for changing things up and maybe working outside the box of normal sanded and non-sanded papers. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at some of these and see what we can get. Right, so this is a piece of velour, so you can just about see the kind of pattern on it, and this is the kind of sort of thickness. It's very thin paper. What was it? Does it tell me it's 260 GSM this? So, you know, it's not massively thick. It definitely doesn't feel like 260. It feels a lot thinner, but I suppose this. Now, velour is Have you ever had one of those fluffy teddy bears that just has this light fuzzy feel to it rather than actual fur, or what you'd get on kind of like a traditional card table or dice or antique vintage table? It's like very fine velvet velour, and that fluff is basically they apply a layer of glue to the surface, and then the velour is put in pretty much almost like an air spray gun, and the particles are so fine that it's just sprayed out onto the paper to create this really fine, even layer of soft fluff, which is what this is. And when you run your hands over it, it feels like soft fluff. It's absolutely amazing. So let's take a look at this with a pastel. We've got our handy dandy yellow pastel, our Rembrandt, and we're just going to pull it down from the top. And you can see it's a very smooth layer of pastel. I've already got it on my fingers. Let me get this a little bit closer, see if you can actually see it, like that. So yeah, you can see it's put in a fine kind of dusty layer. There's not really any dust coming off it because the fine fibres, rather than an actual flat pressed surface, has gripped all that pastel, so it's not really going anywhere. And if I blend it with my finger, it smooths it out in the grain of the fibres, but if I go sideways, you can see it's not really going anywhere. Which is great, especially if you're working on animal portraiture and you've put your initial colour layers down before you may be doing pastel pencil over the top, and you don't want that layer to move. So this is really handy for this. What I'm also going to do is show you really close up the two pieces of textured card I've done. So this is standard recycled cardstock, so the brown standard recycled cardstock, and I have applied, one of them is the Daler texture paste, which is this one I've got here. And the other one I've got and done is standard white gesso. You can get gesso from pretty much any supplier, so it doesn't really matter. Gesso is a very fine compound mixed with basically, I think this one's a white acrylic paint. You can get it in clear if you want to paint over. And often not, it's really good for creating very fine texture on a paper. It will not hold pastel with loads and loads of layers, but it will hold for enough layers that you can work with it. So you probably get as many layers out of this and this as, for example, your pastel papers. So it is good if you want to work maybe in bigger sizes or unusual sizes and you don't want to cut up pastel paper. Or one of the things I've done with it is I've used gesso and the texture paste mixed together, and sometimes added sand or grit in as well, or Golden do a really great pastel ground which is made out of pumice, and applied it to a primed board, so a framed primed board that you can get from most art supplies. The wooden panels that you get for painting straight on with acrylic or oil, if you apply a layer of the gesso to the board, you can paint straight onto that panel board with your pastels. Obviously, the only problem with that is you can't seal it in the same way, so you just have to bear in mind those sorts of things. So let's take a look. We've got, this one is the texture paste. I don't know, you might be able to see, I know it's going to be really hard, but you might be able to see that there's actual grains in the texture paste, and also it goes on very thick. So you'll probably see when I pull this down, you'll be able to see the brush marks of where I applied it. So let's pull this down. There you go. And straight away you can see the brush marks, the lines going sideways. When I apply these sorts of things to a surface, I usually go in an up and down direction first, so horizontal first. Nope, wrong word. Vertical first, let that dry, and then apply a horizontal layer over the top. And you can see the horizontal layer going this way and some of the lines from the vertical layer, and also these brighter bits where you've got one of those grains of pumice in there. Now this is the gesso, so this will be a lot smoother. You can still see some of the lines where my brush marks are, but not nearly as much. So I'm going to show you smoothing these out. As you can see, quite a lot comes off on your fingers. Now, it's not so fine as smoothing out on the textured paste, and that's because there is more texture, so there is more grain, and that's no different to using a sanded pastel paper. The gesso is a lot smoother, so it's very easy to smooth it out completely. However, that does mean you're going to get less layering ability. I've also got one other thing to show you all. So obviously you've got your Miscellaneous, but at the same time, there's also pastel boards. Now, pan pastels. This piece here is Canson Pastel board, so you can see how thick it is. It is proper board, with their surface, their Mi-Teintes surface, applied to the board. So this makes a really good, firm, solid surface if you want to be really heavy-handed with it. And like the pastel paper, the Mi-Teintes pastel paper, it's not really any different. The same texture of the ingress and the same surface type. So I can smooth this out in the same way and apply roughly pretty much the same in the layers. So it doesn't take many layers, but it's a good solid board, and that's great for if you're wanting to work expressively. I wouldn't recommend adding loads of water to one of the boards. So Pastelmat also do boards, mount board, Pastelmat mount board. And the problem with a mount board and with backing boards like this, basically their paper is adhered to the board. However, when they get wet, so if you're using things like water for an underpainting, those boards behind the backing boards soak up the water and warp. Unlike most paper, where it can stretch and return to its original shape as it dries, because the paper is mounted to the board, when both are wet, the board part will stretch but not return to shape, and the paper will try to stretch over the top of it. And what you then find is your board deforms. So you've got to be very careful when using wet mediums with the board type pastel papers. I'm now going to take a look at blendability. So we bring out our wonderful peachy orange colour that we love so much. And this is the textured paste one. And I'm going to turn it. In fact, I'll move these two out of the way. Turn it, and I'm just going to go straight across the middle. And you can see the lines, and then I'm going to blend. As you can see, it blends pretty well over the top on the first pass. No problems there. Gesso. Straight across. Blend. It's having a harder job blending. Now, the reason for that is that the gesso doesn't hold that much pigment. So where it's already held the yellow, note it's then struggled to hold the orange on top of that yellow. And that's because the yellow's already filled most of the tooth. Move those out of the way, and we'll do this again, but with the velour. The velour is kind of like a fluffy version of Pastelmat, really. And easily, straight away, straight over the top, no problems, no concerns. And I'm not even sure why I'm bothering to try and blend, but it doesn't really blend. It just sits there. Now, one of the things you may notice with these is how crisp, if I put these two side by side, how crisp the colours are on this surface compared to velour. Now, because velour is a napped fibre surface, those fibres are a good mil deep, unlike the grain on, say, for example, a texture paste or even Pastelmat, UArt, even just the pastel papers. The grain is a lot finer. So it doesn't, so whilst it can take many layers, it's holding quite large particles, whereas the nap and fibre texture of the velour is very fine, so it's only taking the finest of the powder coming off your pastel. The result of that is that the edges are not crisp and the colours are very muted. This means that if you want to get really strong, bold colours, then you really have to apply a lot of pastel. It's why a lot of pastelists will use pan pastels as a base for whatever they're painting on velour. You can use very soft pastels, and I have a blue earth here, and I will show you what that looks like on the velour, and you can see there will be a noticeable difference because the softness of the pastel, which is also enhanced by how fine the compound powder is in the pastel, adheres better to the finer nap of the velour, and therefore you get a brighter colour. But it also means you get very limited details on this. So you get a very soft, almost romantic look to it. So let me show you. So this is the blue earth pastel. And if I just pull this down over the top, you can see straight away, huge difference, a lot of pastel down. I'm going to apply this one over the top next to it so you can see. And you can see that the Rembrandt is a lot more transparent than the softer blue earth, and that's because the velour is taking more of the pigment from the blue earth than the Rembrandt. So let me blend both of those. You'll see that the blue earth is a lot smoother on the blend, and the Rembrandt just tries to disappear. Right, let's go back over with another one, but we'll go over this one. I lost my pastel, there it is. Right, we'll go back over our texture paste. I won't bother going back over the gesso. I think we can safely say that's at its max with 2 passes, but we'll go back over texture paste, and I would say now you can see a lot more of the orange through the yellow here, and that's telling me that it's pretty much filled whatever texture and tooth there is in the paste that's on the paper. And if I come across, you can see it just smears and blends. So that's pretty much it for that one. Not so much for our velour, so we can move this one out the way a second and concentrate on the velour. We're going to turn the velour again and do another pass with our lovely orange, which may look pink to some. It's kind of like a salmon pink orange. And there we go, straight over the top, no problem whatsoever. We'll go again with our Rembrandt yellow over the top of that one, and the same with our blue earth, just because we can. I suspect we could probably keep doing this for a while before it really fills the tooth, but obviously you can see the more pastel you put down, the more vibrant it's getting. There we go, starting to see the yellow through the orange there, which says to me that it's starting to get a bit full. We'll turn it and do it again, going back down. And yeah, that's pretty much full, I think. Where's the other one? This one. Yeah, so it is starting to struggle now, but you can see it's still doing really well holding the pastel. Not really much in the smudging, so that means that you're not really going to have to worry too much about spread, accidental contamination to other areas. Despite my fingers being somewhat orange, if I run that up and down, you can see it is coming off, so we are starting to get filled, as we should say. Right, so there we have it. There is a whole bunch of different things, surfaces, pastels, techniques, and all your other bits and pieces. You can see that not only can you use and buy standard pastel papers, but you can also think out of the box and use other different types of surfaces, or even create your own. Thank you all for joining me for this tutorial video on what pastel papers should I use. Hopefully you guys have found this video informative and helpful and helped you progress your career and your work in pastels. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Remember, every like and comment is really helpful for this video, and hopefully you'll join me all for my next tutorial, which will be all about pastels.